Welcome back to another episode of Renewable Rides. Today's highlight episode comes from a conversation with Brendan Wallace, co-founder and CEO of Fifth Wall, the largest venture capital firm focused exclusively on real estate and the built environment. In this episode, Brendan puts real numbers behind the scale of the challenge ahead. He breaks down why decarbonizing buildings in the U.S. is an $18 trillion problem, and why historically the real estate industry has invested almost nothing in solving it. We dig into why buildings are increasingly being forced to act like power plants, how energy, data, and capital markets are reshaping what it means to be a real estate owner, and why retailers have led the charge while much of real estate has lagged behind. Brendan also walks through the three forces now bearing down on owners: capital markets, regulation, and tenant demand, and explains why sustainability is no longer a trade-off against profitability, but one of the clearest paths to a cost of capital advantage. If you want to understand why the next era of real estate will be defined by energy infrastructure, this conversation is a must listen. Let's jump in.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe to put some just numbers behind how big, but also how challenging and how daunting the decarbonization of real estate is going to be. It's estimated that it's going to cost $18 trillion to decarbonize buildings and homes in the US, which is just a stat. It's hard to even get your head around a number like that. But to kind of compare that on a relative basis to what was going into the climate tech needed to decarbonize buildings and homes, historically, we did analysis before we started our climate fund. And look, it's imperfect because not all this is disclosed, but what we did look at is we looked at all of the public REITs that were out there, and we looked at all of the investments they had disclosed in their filings.
Yep.
And we added it up over the course of 10 years, and I think the number we came to in aggregate over the course of 10 years for every single REIT was like $96 million that had been invested into climate tech. Now, climate tech is not a holistic solution, so you're not really comparing $96 million to $18 trillion, but clearly you're way off.
Yeah.
And so we set out to raise our first fund to dramatically increase that number. And we've been fortunate. We've had some of the biggest owners and operators and developers of real estate invest in our fund. Firms like Host Hotels and Equity Residential and Hilton and Related and CBRE. We've had now about 110 real estate owners invest in this platform.
Nice.
But we've taken that number now to 800 million in specifically climate capital to decarbonize the real estate industry. So it is still very small in terms of being a drop in the bucket towards 18 trillion, but we've 8x'd the amount of capital that's flowing into this space. And I think that is really exciting, honestly.
It's so good. And I think you're in a very unique position of seeing that intersection of the built environment, energy, data, software. I see your commentary around more buildings need to be thinking about being power plants.
Yeah.
What excites you about that concept? And do you want to expand on what you mean about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the real estate industry is undergoing really a sea change in like what it means to be a real estate owner. I think the business of real estate was historically thought of as like very simple. Like, you don't need to do technology, you don't need to do energy, you're just doing real estate, which is, you maintain a box and people do things in that box. They shop or they live or they work or whatever it is. But increasingly, a lot of responsibility has been thrust on real estate owners. And one part of that responsibility is to, as you said, be a power plant. And that's the last thing that I think anyone who entered the real estate industry thought they'd be doing or wanted to be doing, but it's now the imperative. And the reason is we have a grid that's under a lot of pressure. The way we generate energy needs to become more distributed, meaning we can't just have unidirectional flows of electrons from power plants and substations to consumers of energy. We need to actually be producing energy at the edge, even down to individual homes, and being able to use that throughout the grid. And there's just an imperative around tenancy for landlords to do this. On the one hand, if you don't have enough EV charging at your asset, you're not going to be able to lease your space to certain office tenants. Certainly in the multifamily space, that's the case. But also, if you don't decarbonize and kind of invest in the right energy infrastructure, you won't be able to attract certain tenants.
Yep.
So the responsibility of buildings becoming power plants, I don't think it's necessarily something the industry wanted, but it has been thrust on the real estate industry. And it requires, I think, real estate owners to be very strategic in looking at their asset. It's not just energy efficiency, it's on-premise renewables, it's on-premise storage, it's EV charging, microgrids, virtual power plants. It's understanding how you can monetize it through multiple different channels. And I think this is pretty foreign for the real estate industry. And so I like to think Fifth Wall has been pushing or encouraging the conversation in that direction. But it's still very new for real estate owners to self-conceptualize as being in the business of power plants.
Yeah.
But they are.
And you interviewed Kevin, chairman of Lineage Logistics, this morning. They're one of the shining lights of setting a really positive example here. They're deploying on-site energy systems, being super efficient with their energy consumption. And businesses like Lineage, Walmart, Target, they're actually using it as a way to differentiate their business and, like you say, attract customers, employees, investors. I saw one of your posts where you're like, I'm flying over all these rooftops.
Yeah.
Why haven't more buildings got on-site solar? And
yeah.
I think today it's less than 3% of buildings have on-site systems. What do you think the barrier to adoption is, when you talk to executives and leadership teams?
It's a great question because, I made that comment, and it's kind of a ridiculous comment, but nonetheless, it's true, right? Flying over any city and look out at the rooftops, and you're like, well, we already know levelized cost of energy is cheaper when you have solar. Even if you're still relying on fossil fuels from the grid, it's just cheaper to have solar. And yet, there's not a lot of it. And as I see it, it's just because the real estate is this industry that moves at a glacial pace. And so it's not I don't think it should be surprising to anyone that the organizations that have most enthusiastically embraced solar are retailers, right? The Walmarts of the world, the Targets of the world, because they've always had an operational intensity that has caused them to use technology or use operational advantages like at the core of their business. Real estate's never really had to do that. And as a result, it just takes a long time for the real estate industry to digest these changes. I mean, you think about cell towers, right? And the opportunity for digital infrastructure on roofs. I mean, that's been an imperative for 3 decades now. And still, a lot of real estate owners haven't evaluated that opportunity. So I think what we're just confronting is maybe a sociological or like an anthropological problem of like real estate needs to change its posture with respect to technology and innovation. And when it does, the other 97% of roofs are going to be in play, and that's a big opportunity. So I know that's not a super heartwarming, satisfactory answer, but I think it's the truth.
Yeah. I think the reality is business leaders want to run their business, don't they? And they've never had to think about energy ever.
Exactly.
And now to your point, they're being expected to because costs have gone up. Outages are impacting their business. They're now being expected to be more sustainable. And I think something I've heard time and time again through the conference over the last few days is we need to make it super simple.
Yeah.
And we need to unlock the opportunity for people to see these value streams. Do you think business leaders are realizing yet that sustainability actually means greater profitability? Or do you think they still see it as a trade-off of you have to do one or the other?
It's a great question. And I don't know exactly where we are, and I'm sure it varies a bit by geography and by asset class, but you kind of have the carrot, the profit incentive, a cost of capital advantage that might be conferred through decarbonizing faster, and then you have the stick, right? You have fines and regulations and negative press, right, that might come with not doing so. And I kind of think about all of the real estate industry as being at the center of like 3 vectors. One is capital markets, one is local regulation, and the third is just the demand for real estate itself, so tenants. So capital markets, clearly we know today that more energy efficient real estate trades at a higher multiple, right, and lower yields. And there's real cost of capital advantages. And large allocators of capital have said, we'll preferentially deploy capital to low or no carbon footprint real estate. That's happening. That's been happening for years, and I think it's only going to accelerate. I think there's a lot more room for that to happen, and there's a lot more transparency around which that can happen, but that's just starting. That's more on the offensive side of things. And I think some owners, typically the largest owners, are seeing that. You look at what Prologis is doing and kind of huge footprint real estate owners, they're starting to take advantage of this cost of capital, scale advantage in deploying technology across their big footprints. The second is regulation. Now that's more of a stick. And the way I see that is real estate is taxed and regulated locally, not federally. And local regulators have said, we want to drive compliance with our decarbonization efforts, and we're just going to tax you, right? You can't move real estate, so it's very easy to tax. So there's things like Local Law 97 in New York, and the way I see that is just kind of bending the cost curve, kind of pulling, the ROE frontier in terms of making owners justify it. But that's clearly the stick that's also driving behavior. And the last is tenants, which is some, large national footprint retailers and companies like Google and Meta and Walmart. They've said, we're not going to lease space from you unless you adhere to certain sustainability criteria. Right. And so that's the private market speaking. I think the real estate industry is kind of awkwardly in the middle of all of these vectors. And it's not super clear to me which is the most compelling to them. But what I can say in aggregate is it's all working, because the behavior and the disposition of large real estate companies with respect to new technology solutions to decarbonize, it's radically different than 5 years ago when we started our climate fund. And I think it is a mix of carrot and stick. And I think what we will see, and this is probably a longer conversation, is I think we will see some owners truly embrace this, like what Tom Steyer's doing with his business, where they will be able to demonstrably prove to the market that they have a cost of capital advantage by virtue of being the most energy efficient real estate operator. And debt investors get that, equity investors get that, and that enables them to scale in a way that no one could before them. We haven't yet seen that, but I hope we do, because that will really send a signal to the market.
It was interesting. We actually just helped close a deal for a cold storage warehouse in Northern California yesterday. We run a marketplace competition for them to reduce their energy costs, to be able to compete in the market, increase their margins. We're able to help them secure a 20-year energy deal at 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and they were paying the utility 25 cents.
Wow.
So it's over $25 million worth of savings.
Yeah.
And that's just amazing, isn't it? And if you think about businesses doing that across their entire portfolio, the compounding value of that is huge. And then it gives you that cost of capital advantage and the margin to actually go and really accelerate your business.
Exactly. And I think also, the energy savings is also, I think because real estate is in this odd position sometimes of not paying for its own electricity. It creates this weird disincentive. There's this kind of transparency barrier between, what's the tenant's responsibility and what's getting passed through the tenant. Now, the laws of microeconomics mean that if cost of occupancy is higher because you haven't invested in these solutions, you're still paying for it in the form of lower rent. But I think landlords sometimes miss that, which is why I don't think it's surprising that spaces like the hospitality industry that pays their own energy bills are most focused on this, because they immediately capture the savings they're able to generate by virtue of these investments. So the kind of triple net structure that characterizes a lot of leases in real estate, I do think is a barrier in and of itself to the adoption of a lot of new solutions.
Yeah, but you think that might switch as the economics start making more sense?
I think so, because I think increasingly tenants are just going to look at the all-in cost of space. And the all-in cost of space is obviously inclusive of energy costs. I wouldn't rule out that some real estate owners take a different posture and say, we actually want to be energy providers to you. We want to be your utility. I know that's not happening a lot, but if you are best in class at being able to generate clean energy on premise and store it, you should be the best at monetizing it. And that means you could monetize it to the tenant or even back to the grid itself.
That's right.
And I just have to believe that really entrepreneurial landlords will start to do that. Although we're not really seeing that today, I think that's the promise and that's the potential of where we could go.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.